Welcome to the Legal Academy, episode 13. I'm your host, Orin Kerr. My guest this week is Kristin Henning, the Agnes N. Williams Research Professor and the Director of the Juvenile Justice Clinic at the Georgetown University Law Center. Professor Henning is the former lead attorney of the Juvenile Unit at the Public Defender's Service in Washington, D.C., and she's published a number of law review articles on questions of race and the juvenile justice system, and most importantly, from my perspective, the Fourth Amendment. She's been a visiting professor at Yale, where she received her J.D., and also at NYU, and just really, Kristin, you're just a leader in clinical education, and I'm so excited to have you on the show to talk about the role of clinical education.
Yeah, happy to be here. I love what you're doing. I love these conversations, so I'm glad to participate.
Great, awesome. So I want to just jump right in. So what do you see as the role of law school clinics in legal education? And the reason one debate that I often hear framed around the role of law school clinics is that are law school clinics about training law students? Are they about the causes that the clinics are endorsing? Is it sort of like a thinking of the approach of legal education of let's identify important causes and pursue them? Is it all of the above? Kind of give us sort of your picture of what you see as the ultimate goals of law school clinical education.
Absolutely. So I'm going to answer you with a both and, that it is absolutely the social justice mission, and it is what we offer students by way of our pedagogical mission. But I'm going to choose, I'm a bit biased, so I'm going to start with the social justice side. But I think I am right about that. If we look at the history of clinical legal education, it really has its roots in the really pivotal questions of our country, the civil rights movement, the feminist movement. And so clinical education started before the 60s, but it really got its foothold from the 60s to the 90s. And many of the critical questions that law students came together with their professors was around the social justice mission. So I think, again, my bias is it's very much a social justice mission. And we think about Gideon's, I call it Gideon's promise, so the promise of Gideon versus Wainwright, and having lawyers for indigent defendants. And the law schools really helped move that forward by providing free legal assistance to folks in the criminal justice system. So it's really, I think, fitting. I also think understanding sort of the social justice framework for clinical legal education is critical today, given the protests after the killing of George Floyd. We are uniquely positioned in clinical programs across the country to take a stand and to engage students meaningfully in concrete ways in bringing about reform. So policy clinics, all of the criminal legal and juvenile legal clinics, all of the civil rights clinics across the country, all of the appellate clinics across the country, and so many more are well poised to address this moment right now. #MeToo. All of the domestic violence clinics across the country, uniquely poised to address these questions. Trump's ban on immigration from Muslim countries. Our asylum clinics are uniquely poised to address some of these issues. So I think social justice for me is the prevailing question or prevailing goal. Did you want to?
Yeah, well, there's a really interesting part of that too, which is law schools trying to figure out which clinics to add. Yeah. I just from the outside, I've seen these debates over whether to add certain clinics, and then there's a question of to what extent is the cause one that the school wants to endorse? To what extent is it obviously the question of what's going to be a good experience for students is critical. But there's also there was a dispute, maybe it was last year, maybe 2 years ago at Harvard, I believe, where there were conservative students were saying, well, if the goal is causes, why aren't there any clinics about causes that, I think, and I think I shouldn't do this from memory, but I think Harvard added a religious liberty clinic, which I guess Stanford has one as well. And I gather that was sort of a response to that. And I guess the question is, how should law schools choose what clinics to have in light of, there's going to be disagreement about what causes a school might want, and also just lots of choices, right? Like,
Absolutely.
there's so many important causes. How should law schools think about, should we add a clinic along a certain line?
So interestingly enough, I just, had to grapple, or I'm often grappling with this question. I just finished a 3-year term as associate dean for clinical programs at Georgetown. Okay. And throughout the 3 years, we are constantly revisiting that question. Do we have the right mix of clinics? And do, every time we make a hire, what new clinics should we bring on board, or should we expand existing ones? And here are some things that we consider. Absolutely, the pedagogical value of the clinic is really important. So, it ties back to your first question about, is it social justice? Is it what we teach our students? And there is a piece of the pedagogical value of skills development, of conveying and teaching values to students. What I love about clinical legal education, it is an extraordinary mix or extraordinary opportunity to apply theory and law to practice, but bringing in doctrine, bringing in ethics, bringing in skills. And so it's legal research and writing, it is oral advocacy, it is negotiation, it is all of that. So I think that's a really critical question you have to decide in figuring out which clinics. And what I say most important is the mix. So it is, as your clinical dean, what does my full package look like? Do I have an array for students to pick and choose from? Because I will say this to you, we firmly believe, and I firmly believe that the skills, whatever subject matter you enter in a clinic, the skills are transferable to almost any other category. So that even if you're not interested in criminal justice as your passion, you can be in a criminal justice clinic and then later do immigration policy. Like, the skills that we learn should be transferable. So I think that's really important. I think causes matter, but here's what I think is, to be quite frank, it is you choose the best faculty, right? You get excellent talent, and where do their passions lie? Because if we believe that we can convey the same set of skills and the same, values and the same application of law and practice, then it doesn't. The subject matter matters a little bit less.
Yeah. So this is great. So this actually gets to what was going to be my next question. Is sort of the question of hiring clinical faculty members and what to look for. And I'll say, sort of, as I'm a quote unquote podium professor, non-clinical, even though I practice a little bit on the side, but not in a clinic. I've always deferred to what the clinical professors on the faculty already think. So and that's out of a view of like, well, I'm not particularly well equipped to say who's going to be a great clinical professor. So
yeah.
What should the podium professors be looking for? And maybe the answer is always defer to the clinical professor.
No, right. Start there. No, I'm just kidding. No. I think as a community, right? That's great. I love it. So here's the deal. I think as a community of podium and clinical faculty, we should all be on one accord on this issue and should have meaningful conversations about what it looks like. But here's what we've come to, and we literally at Georgetown, we refine it. And here's where we've landed, like in my term as associate dean, and even before me, but it's 4 things, 4 broad strokes. One is you're looking for legal expertise. And notice where I put that, okay? Legal expertise, because you're running a clinic that we need you steeped and talented in your area of law. We also need, though, management skills, because when you're running, which is really odd, you never think about this. And this is why we had to put it as one of our 4 priorities, because when you think about hiring someone as a law professor, you don't really look for management skills. But if you're running a clinic, you've got to be able to, right, it's a front-facing and interior-facing, student-facing, I should say, and community-facing function, and a management function. And it really requires a set of skills that everybody doesn't come into the legal academy with. The third thing is wonderful teaching skills. And these aren't necessarily in order. We actually consider them equal. But scholarship, and I know we'll probably come back and talk about this more, like the role of clinicians in scholarship, but we firmly believe in scholarship. So a robust, curricula of scholarship, and we can talk about whether there are any variations. And then teaching, right? Is critically important. The clinical pedagogical method is so important because it's important anyway in the legal academy, but you really spend so much time with your students. And our goal is, if we are teaching students to apply the law and to apply theory to real people and to real communities, then that pedagogical method becomes all the more important, right? We're not giving answers, right? We're helping students arrive at answers, so that when they're out in the field and working in a community meeting or working with an individual client, that they have the skills to think on their own and to navigate and to handle the questions that they are presented with. So it's really these broad strokes, and I think they're equal. Then they have to be equal for a clinician, but you have to think long and hard about what does that portfolio look like for a clinical professor.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting. And then you mentioned a little bit ago that you're constantly rethinking what clinics are offered. And then have you had success sort of keeping the personnel and then switching topics, being like, well, we did this kind of case for 10 years. I can imagine there are some situations that are sort of contingent on the political world or what's going on in the news, where post 9/11, you might have a set of issues that you're focused on, and then 10 years later, okay, that issue is more or less settled, and then you move on to another issue. Have you had success sort of switching to new topics within the same personnel?
So yes, and so I should say Georgetown is interesting because we have really one of the largest clinical programs in the country, and because of that, and so I share that to say that other schools may have to do this piece differently. So we hire into subject matter areas, and so we have the luxury of saying, well, this year we really believe we have I'm just making this up though, we have a shortcoming, let's just say, in juvenile justice, and so we can hire someone with that level of expertise. Many law schools across the country will say, we need a robust clinical program. We need a robust set of offerings, and they'll post for clinical education. And then they'll have people bring their passion to the table and make their pitch for why. I think either of those are appropriate. Your question about, can we switch once we're within? And so we hire into subject matter, and the expectation is, look, I'm an expert in juvenile justice, so I will probably stay in that. But within that, there's so much I can do. So here's a perfect example. My clinic very much started, it's been around for 40 years. We have been very much, yes, a bread and butter juvenile defense or criminal defense clinic, representing clients on the front line. Over time, however, we realized that we cannot continue to do just this work without doing systemic reform. And so we launched, so I'm actually now, we're the Juvenile Justice Clinic and Initiative, because we have added a policy piece. And so we do a much more robust clinical program now. We have active, policy cases. We have, we do, trainings across the country. So those kinds of things. I think,
sorry, are policy cases, does that mean like proposing or advocating for legislation? Sort of what is the student role in that tend to be?
So this is interesting. So I should not even talk about mine, because I feel like policies is our secondary. So we have whole policy clinics. And so the student's role is, so a part of the social justice mission is serving clients and serving communities. And lawyering is about letting your clients and your communities lead. right? So they're the voice. So a good policy clinic has clients, right? And so let's say, I don't know, the Sierra Club, has a policy agenda that they want to push forward. And so our students may team up in a policy clinic and advocate at the, for the stated interest and the stated goals of that client. Right. So a very client driven. And that's, every, clinic, you could have your own policy agenda that you set within house and that you push out. But a lot of the policy clinics have clients, and then they help the clinic shape their agenda and strategize about what makes sense, things of that nature.
Okay, interesting. Your description of this is, which is incredibly interesting and super helpful, is it's also resource intensive.
Yes.
And Georgetown is a university, one of the biggest, if not the biggest. I think it may be the biggest law school, and obviously it's a top elite prestigious law school, which is a well-funded school. How does it vary at other institutions? So one really interesting aspect of the episodes we've done so far is we're talking about a lot of podium professors and scholarship, and most law schools are offering basically the same law school curriculum, right? There are variations in the upper level electives, but at least for the podium classes, like everyone's taking contracts, everyone's taking torts, so there's a lot of commonality. And is it, my impression is that there's a lot more variation when it comes to clinical offerings, with some schools having a lot of clinical offerings and some schools having a lot fewer. And I was hoping you could explain, first, is that impression right? And then if it is right, kind of what are the causes of that? Is it just money? Is it culture? Is it kind of what might explain those variables?
That's a great question. I think it's both. It's, again, another both and. I think it's money. I think it's culture. I think, some of it is, is vision. So let me talk about each of the pieces, if I can. I will say this for folks listening, is it's an investment well worth making. You're absolutely right. It is, a costly endeavor, but it really is an investment worth making. And I'll make that pitch, as to say, when thinking about what is it, who do we want to, what kind of lawyers do we want to produce for the world? And lawyers who have had clinical legal education are just so well poised to make the world a better place, to be quite frank, in however you define that. We often have judges, at every, stage, from, the Supreme Court to the federal circuits to state courts, telling us that students who come out of clinical programs are just so much better equipped, or just really well equipped to come into a clerkship, for example. Same thing in law firms. They're looking for that bodes well. So producing the lawyers that we want, it is getting jobs for our students in the ways that our students care about. It is teaching people to be better, be better analysts, or, legal analysts, I think is all very important. And so is it a cost? It's a cost. It's cost worth making. And how do schools decide? I think culture. Georgetown has a really strong social justice mission. We're a Jesuit tradition. We are not going to have a law school that doesn't have a robust clinical program. We're just not. And so there's that. And so I think schools should ask that question, and particularly in a moment like this, Orin, I think it's really a question. What kind of law school do I want to be? And if you want to be a school committed to social justice and making a difference, I think in your local community, in your state, and then nationally, you got to have a strong clinical program. So that's a cultural question. And then, I think in terms of resource, it's also about, I am a proponent of what we call hard funding. So it's, it's raising the dollars to have the clinical programs exist in-house. But I have to say, there is soft funding. Soft funding comes at moments like this, when foundations want to make a difference, and they want to make a difference in racial justice, or, in the wake of #MeToo, or, in the wake of, conservative politics, and people want to make a difference. There's money to be had. And so that I would encourage law schools to either do that fundraising specific for clinical programs themselves, to partner with local organizations that will provide that funding, or to hire faculty who can bring funding with them at a moment like this, I think is really critical.
Interesting. I remember a few years ago there was a discussion at the ABA level about mandating some sort of experiential education, and that could be clinics, it could be externships, it could be lots of different things. Do you have a feeling or a sense of sort of schools thinking through how to provide some sort of an experiential part, how they should think about that? And I should say, like when I was in law school, I did an externship in the U.S. Attorney's office, which was just absolutely invaluable to me. I mean, I learned so much just being in an office surrounded by lawyers, talking about lawyerly things and talking about the world. I was like, oh, like here's how it all fits together. And it was just incredibly valuable for me. That was an externship kind of experience, although they called it a clinic. And there are all these different ways. Are there, do you kind of see them as similar in at least the student experience, or should schools think about, basically maybe is it like, no, you want to do a clinic, you don't want to do externship programs, or any of these are fine? Like, how should schools think through kind of making sure students have these experiences?
Yeah, so your timing is just right to ask that question. So just last year, so as I said, I just ended a 3-year term as associate dean, and in my 3rd year, I think I'm right about that, or is it my last 2 years? 2 of the 3 years. Yes, 2 of the 3 years, we made a decision at Georgetown to combine the clinical dean portfolio is actually the associate dean for clinics and experiential learning. Okay. And so we brought under one umbrella clinics, externships, and practica. So those are your 3 categories that you're really talking about, and they're all a little bit different. We have a strong preference. Well, we have all 3, and we have all 3 robustly. But we have a strong preference for being able to give students a clinical education opportunity if we can. And we say that because it really, we are, as faculty, we have full-time tenured faculty in the classroom for the seminar component. We have full-time, tenured faculty going out into the field, advocating with our students. In ways that you can't, do in an externship. So it's almost like, for lack of better words, it's a capstone, right, on externships and practica. So we will allow our students to do an externship, a practicum, and then a clinic. Right. So I recognize those students, many law schools don't have all of those. So I would say, like, as you're thinking about what your mix looks like, having as many clinical programs or clinical offerings as your budget will allow would be my recommendation. But that absolutely, just as you just said, externships are exceedingly valuable. Creating a robust externship program, and here's the key for a robust externship program, there's a wonderful community of externship professors. And the key is having a strong externship mentoring program within the law school. A strong externship seminar component. It's usually like a 1 credit, component that goes with that. And I think when the externship movement started, we just sort of sent people out. And maybe they would, right, and then maybe they would have, somebody they would check in with at the law school. But for really quality externship programs, you got to have someone at the law school who is, who's doing oversight of the students and of the employers. And then the 3rd category is this practicum. These practica, right, which are courses somewhere between an externship and a clinic, and we really bring in usually an adjunct professor, somebody who's practicing. That's the idea. Just as you said, you want that connection with somebody who's working out in the field. And what's great about DC, but it's true all over the country, is we've got all these federal entities, right? All these federal agencies, and somebody can come to the law school and teach a wonderful, phenomenal class, and create and as a part of that practica or that practicum, they can have work projects. right? So they would have, let's say, a fact-finding mission, or a white paper, or a briefing paper, or some legislative advocacy, whatever their projects are within the clinic, or within, excuse me, within the practica.
Interesting. Yeah, it's super interesting. So I wanted to turn to a different topic, which is the role of clinical faculty on a faculty. So there are obviously the different episodes I've had so far have been the Podium faculty, and then add in clinical professors and Podium faculty, and I've seen on past faculties, I should say, not my current faculty, there can be some tensions there about directions, and there are a lot of different issues. And one of them that I wanted to start with is the question of sort of rights and privileges of faculty members, salary of faculty members, where you used to have a world where it was all the Podium tenured professors teaching their contracts and torts classes, and then, as you said, sort of in 1970-ish around you start getting clinics, and then there's this question of how do clinical faculty members, how do they fit? And I've been on past faculties where there were votes, to whether to tenure clinical faculty members, and what are the standards for promotion, and what are the standards for, and just sort of how you have those two somewhat distinct worlds, and maybe even increasingly distinct worlds. How do you have them coexist and everybody get along and the like?
So let me start, actually. So it's interesting. I would say we are having increasingly less distinct worlds. Okay. And the way I know that it's not just Georgetown, and it hasn't been just Georgetown for a while, but the way we know it's not is the way the market is going. Meaning the AALS market is very much, it might not look integrated on its face, because you'll see a clinical posting, but that when I mentor, I don't care who you're calling me from, where you're, what school you're applying from, I invariably get the question, do I need to have scholarship, or what does my portfolio need to look like? And it looks increasingly across the country just like, Podium faculty. So I think, I would be doing a disservice to people that I mentor if I don't push people to get as close to that Podium model as possible. Now, I will say at Georgetown, I'm a bit biased because we have an integrated track. It is truly the same. It's the same hiring committee. We might have a subcommittee to look at a specific area, but it's the same committee, it's the same standards, it's the same tenure requirements, it's all of that. And so I come from that tradition, and I think it's exceedingly valuable as a model. So you say rights and privileges, salaries, all of that. Also, I should say, it rights, privileges, and responsibilities.
Yeah. Sorry, you're stuck on that committee too.
Yes, I am definitely on that committee. I'm on those 5 committees, in fact. And and I'm chairing one and being on another one. So absolutely, yes. And so that was going to be, I actually made a note to say this, because I always like to say this, because that's my bent, is the integrated model. And so what it means, rights and responsibilities, means that you definitely have all the responsibility. You're chairing, you're doing all of that. But the concern is, and so I'll say this for clinicians, out there, our caseloads are heavy. Right? And our client responsibilities are heavy, and our community engagement is wide and broad, and it makes it hard to do it all. So you're telling me you want me to write scholarship, and you want me to chair a committee, and you want me to, teach my class and all of this. And so you have to decide whether that's what you want to go into. I do think the clinical world is moving there. The people that I mentor, the people who come and seek advice, that's what they're applying to across the country. They're applying to these integrated models, and the expectations are high.
Yeah, now that you say that, I'm thinking oh yeah, I can think of definite examples of that sort of integration happening. Why do you think that trend is happening? What are the pressures that are pushing?
Oh, that's a wonderful question. I would say my mentors, would say that it has evolved naturally for so many reasons. I think as clinicians, began to write, so let's say the clinical movement started as a social justice movement, but that the people who are naturally drawn into the academy have the passion for scholarship that Podium faculty do, and it became, a standard bearer. I also think, to be honest with you, questions of equity in the law school. I mean, we're people who care. Lawyers care about equity, and law professors care a lot about equity. And so, to be in a community where you have second-class citizens and where you have tiers wasn't going to last very long anyway. And so, I know that was a part of the push from the generation above me. So you asked about questions like salary and parity and voting rights, and there were law schools across the country that were voting on which faculty members to hire for the clinics, and the clinical faculty didn't have a vote. That's a problem. So I think I think all of those reasons come into play, and I think honestly some of it is the social justice attracts often, people of color and women around some issues. And you've got to be careful about having an academy that has a tier system where you have, a higher percentage of people of color and women maybe in the clinical programs. And so I think that has been a part of the push to shift us in a different direction as well.
Yeah, that's interesting. It makes sense. And I also wonder if it's, and this is just a question, is it also, it's such a competitive position.
Yes.
And so we've seen all across the board, right? Every position in the legal academy has gotten more competitive. And you often hear from senior professors, I would have never gotten this job if it had been me. And a lot of times, well, it's just a different world where you would go to get it. So you would have done more to try to get it. But in a world where it's that much more competitive, is it just like those that have checked the boxes and succeeded in the Podium world can then sort of, where you've got most of the votes on a faculty of who to hire Absolutely. Coming from Podium, they'll be like, oh, I see like these good law review articles, I'm happy. Or like, is it just sort of that market pressure maybe that's even?
Absolutely. And I actually thought about that a couple of times during our conversation, that it sort of popped in my head that honestly, absolutely, the competition, the market. And so when I talk about mentoring young scholars who are coming, or young clinicians who want to enter the academy, I say to them, if you want to be competitive, you need to do these 4 things. Even if your law school doesn't currently think, or the schools that you're interested in don't currently think that this is what you need, I guarantee you, once they start looking at applications, they're going to see that they can have that. And exactly what you said, to the extent that you've got Podium faculty voting on the hiring, they're going to be gravitating to those folks who look most like them on paper.
Right.
And so you're absolutely right about that.
Yeah, no, that I've definitely, it goes back to, that I was saying before, I just defer to the clinical faculty members. And then it's like, to the extent a resume looks like, oh yeah, this is, then that's easy, right? Like, this clicks all the boxes, and you don't have to think about it from the standpoint of somebody who's like may consider themselves an outsider to that choice. So that makes a lot of sense. And then from the standpoint of a person who wants to become a clinical professor, what do they do? What is the path? And you talked about experience as a top advocate, for example. So maybe it's just you get that experience, but I'm interested in those that are interested in becoming clinical professors. What's the either path or most common paths?
So I gotta, look, I think, again, this is going to be some of my bias, but it certainly played out in my career path. You got to work. You got to work first. And so, I think, to be quite frank, all law professors should work first. I call it work first. That's as if we're not working. But right, like, I think you got to be out in the street. You got to be with the people. You got to like be a lawyer and know what it means to be a lawyer, right? We're better professors when a student comes up to us on break and and ask a question, and we're able to understand how it really, it's just what you said, you were saying in your externship, oh, this is how this works, right? Like, we need to be able to actually answer that and not just theorize about it. But even more so in the clinic, you got to work. And so I was, so there's a couple of paths that just popped in my head. One is there are a number of clinical fellowship opportunities. So you graduate from law school, and then there are some schools like Georgetown. We have a really robust clinical fellowship program for people who have graduated from law school, and some of whom have even worked for several years and then apply to be one of our fellows and learn the pedagogical method and learn and get experience as a good teacher coming onto the market. But we're looking for people who have been out in the field. So I think that's one thing. We're also, looking for people who are intellectually curious, right? And intellectually engaged, not just for scholarship, not just scholarship for scholarship's sake, but scholarship that demonstrates that you're thinking transformatively about the law, right? So even in my clinic, my own individual juvenile justice clinic, our clinic materials for students who are interested in applying, have a phrase is we're looking for students who are interested in assessing the laws and changing them, are talking about how we might change them when they're no longer useful or when they become harmful to folks. And so I share that to say that that's what we're looking for in a really good professor. That scholarship shows that you're thinking rigorously about the state of the law, right? Or the state of policy and how you might move that forward or change that or endorse that if that's appropriate. And so I think that's what we're looking for as well.
And then are the fellowships environments where the scholarship happens? Because I imagine, let's say you want to be a clinical professor, you become a practicing lawyer, PDS, for example, which has generated a very large number of law professors, clinical, non-clinical, across the board. And then it's very difficult to write law review articles while you are a public defender. In the 7 minutes you have free of your day.
Exactly.
And so is the idea that you practice for a few years and then take the fellowship. During the fellowship, you write the scholarship to impress the Podium faculty and then go on the market? Is that kind of like a...
Oh, that's a really good question. I wish it were that smooth. So the answer is, for those who are lucky enough to get those fellowships, yes. I don't even want to say lucky enough. There are a number of fellowships out there, but everybody who's going on the clinical market, there just isn't enough fellowship. There aren't enough fellowships. So everybody's not going to have that track. So the answer is, that is awesome. If you can do it, do a fellowship, because yes, it should give you some of that opportunity. But I got to say, even some of the clinical fellowships, like, are pretty, intensive. And so it's hard even to find writing. But yes, absolutely. So for example, the Georgetown clinical program, fellowship program, has mentoring. We have wonderful faculty mentors around scholarship, and we do job talks with our faculty, our fellows who are going on the market. So yes, ideally, that's the path. So the challenge is, and this is why I say I think clinical faculty are some of the most extraordinary human beings, because they've got to figure out, how do I write while I'm still practicing,
right,
or how do I demonstrate my intellectual curiosity and the like. And so
all you have to do is do everything.
That's all you have to do. That's all, I don't know what the problem is, right? So that's exactly right. So sometimes this is another thing to point out to folks, is that when you're in the entering market of the entering market for clinical positions. Some of the schools will give some leeway. So they might take a shorter paper, right, instead of a traditional law review. Like if you've got some, 2 or 3 pieces that are placed in like some, a legal journal that's not a traditional law review, that might be considered. We might also look at some briefs that you have written that are really, really, really robust. In addition to at least one work in progress that's more of a traditional law review. So in other words, and I do encourage law schools to do this, is to be a bit more expansive at the outset for a completely brand new entering professor who has come from a job where they have no opportunity to write. That we will look more broadly at those other pieces, but expect that you will produce a job talk that's traditional. Does that make sense?
That makes a lot of sense. And I think the framework of thinking about the entry-level hiring makes a lot of sense in terms of satisfying the practice requirement, having some sort of scholarship to kind of be able to please the different audiences. That makes a lot of sense. And then there's the question though of tenure and promotion throughout a career. And actually a question I should know the answer to, but I don't. Is there what's the proportion of clinical professorship positions that are tenure track
Oh, wow.
tenure? Do you know?
I really wish I
Ballpark.
knew the answer to that. There is, for folks who are interested, there is, I believe on the AALS website, there's, it's called the I wish I knew what it stood for, CSALE. I feel terrible for everybody, but you can find this data, like this is the kind of data you can find, like what percentages are, but what you can do, more importantly, honestly, is you want to figure out, like, school by school by school, what their approach is. So at Georgetown, we are, I would say, what, 90% tenure track. We have professors from practice, and we have a couple of contract professors for any variety of reasons, and they serve different needs, for our community, right? And so it's a culture. It's a real culture question. Yeah.
And then I guess what I'm thinking, let's assume a school where there is it's a tenure track / tenured line that the clinical faculty member is in.
Yes.
What should the standard for tenure be? What should the standard for promotion be?
That's a really good question. So, yeah.
Because it's like, there are debates of this obviously in the podium context, but it's usually about, like, how many law review articles should the person write? And it's assumed that the person is teaching their classes but spending a tremendous amount of their time writing. And then you have a job where it's like, okay, you wrote scholarship in order to get the position, but you're a lawyer and you're teaching students, and that's a totally different world. How should we think about what the ideal tenure standard should be?
Yeah. Did I say clinicians were superstars? Did I mention that? No.
Yeah. Agreed upon and implicit.
Yeah, right. So in all seriousness, though, like, it depends on the school. At Georgetown, we do everything they do plus what we do. And so our tenure standard is the same. There's no separate written standard for clinical and non-clinical, and we don't deviate from that. So that's a choice that we made as a community. A clinician who is not interested in that approach should not apply for Georgetown, right? Should not try to enter. There are schools who take a different view on that, that, you write to get in as entry level. And again, that they will continue as they decide whether you're tenured or not. They will look more broadly at briefs or all the other work that you're doing. It really varies widely from school to school to school. There are a number of schools that have long-term contracts, which is, so I should, just the politics of it all. So there's tenure track, which gives you longevity, it gives you protection, and it gives you status. But people, young clinicians who are most concerned about status. In other words, nobody wants to go to a law school and be on a year-to-year contract, right? That's not, so that's separate than really the status question, right? And that's different than the equity question. But they just want to make sure I don't get fired tomorrow. And so that's what, so the equivalent is the long-term contract route. And so you'll see that, and that's sometimes in some of the elite schools as well, that they're saying, hey, we respect you, we're not going to let you go, but we set up different standards when we created our program, but here's your long-term contract. The tenure model does all of that. It gives you parity on pay, it gives you parity on responsibility, it gives you parity on rights, but it also means you got to do your scholarship exactly as the podium faculty.
And is there a general rule for what kind of law schools are going to have different models? Is it?
No, that's a really good question too. I wish I knew the answer to that. I think it was a question you asked earlier. What is it about? And I think it's about money. I think it's about culture. I think those are the two drivers for that. Honestly, and I think probably 3 is leadership, right? And when I say leadership, is having someone. So even if the culture isn't there, right, and maybe the money isn't there, if you have somebody really strong, either on your faculty or in close relationship as an alum to the school, they can really push the development of a strong clinical program. We've seen that happen as well. So. Yeah, I really think it's really about, so the schools differ. So you see state schools, with lower funding have really, really strong commitments to social justice. And then you have private Ivy Leagues that say, okay, we value it, but we're not doing it. You know what I mean? So I think it's, yeah.
Yeah. No, it makes sense that it's a cultural question. You know, in 1935, Dean so and so said this is what our school is about,
Right.
and then 80 years later, that's what we're doing.
Yeah.
So I can totally imagine that. And I wanted to return to the culture, not really a culture question, but the sort of not gap, but potential differences between the clinical faculty member and the podium faculty member. And as you were exactly, you made a ton of sense in saying that these days, especially the junior clinical hires, are people who could be competitive in the non-clinical, like the people are so good and they're so credentialed and they've got their law review articles and they're really strong. And at the same time, as you have clinical faculty members maybe moving towards the podium model, you have the podium model moving towards the PhD model.
Yes, right.
And so maybe they're, the one's moving towards the other, but the other is sort of chasing away as well. I wonder kind of how this plays out in 10 or 20 years, where are we going to be in a world where this I'll put the extreme version. The only people who have any idea what lawyering is are the clinical faculty members.
Right.
The podium faculty member are PhDs in their areas, and then you run into sort of clinical faculty members are going to be needing to play an important, an even broader role on a faculty in sort of rooting it in the law. Yeah. Or is that? I mean,
so I'm going to offer a different perspective that I see, and maybe we're just seeing different things. You're West Coast, I'm East Coast. So here's what I'm seeing, though. And in particular in a moment like this in our country, I am so absolutely. So I shouldn't have said. I should see I see what you're saying. Also, yes, historians, PhDs, all of that are also joining the legal academy. However, at the same time, I am seeing more podium faculty interested in partnering with clinicians around issues that they care about, right? And so I think they feel the same thing that we feel. You can do the theory, you can do the writing, you can do the theory, you can do the scholarship, but there's a point at which I really want to make a difference. And then how do I actualize that? So I see that a lot at Georgetown. It's not even just at really at other schools where people will say, I've been writing this article. I've been thinking about family law in this way as a matter of theory, and I'd really like to put some piece of that in practice, or I'd really like to see some policy advanced around that, right? And so there's a marriage of the clinicians with the podium, and I think that's very active and very alive, and I'm finding it even more now.
Yeah, and it's super interesting. And it raises a question, actually, that I could take advantage of your recent dean expertise, is just the nuts and bolts of how schools blend roles in a way. Like, do you have let's say you've got a clinical professor who wants to teach 1L criminal law, which many do, or, is it like, okay, you're not on the clinic one semester, or is it the expectation of you do everything, and in addition, teach a 1L class?
Yes, right.
How practically do associate deans tend to
figure that out,
blend those roles and allow people to do both sides?
So that's also a really, really wonderful question. And I think you see a number of different models. And our perspective is this: because they're tenure track at Georgetown, I'll give you some other examples other places, but because they're tenure track, and tenured, most of our clinicians are now tenured. So once they're tenured, you get to do what, you have that freedom. So we have clinics we have faculty members who teach one semester in the clinic, one semester Civ Pro. One semester in the clinic, one semester at Civ Pro. The way they do that, though, because we have such a robust clinical program, we have the clinical offerings all year long. So they have a co-teacher, a partner, and so they just alternate. So that's one thing, is having team teachers, so that faculty have the freedom to do something like that. There are indeed faculty members who are in our clinics who teach seminars in addition to their clinic. They're glutton for punishment. I taught a practicum once. I don't know what I was thinking. I had my whole clinic and a practicum. But people teach ethics. Our clinicians teach ethics courses, Civ Pro, Crim Pro. So you see a little bit of everything. I will say this, and this is going to be my bias. So at Georgetown, we never force anyone to do that. I would never say to a clinician, you have to, by mandate, teach blah. there are schools that do that. And I just say to the administrators who are listening to me, that's hard, right? Like making your clinician run a clinic and teach a first year crim law, criminal justice class is a hard thing to do, particularly for 1Ls, and they're large classes. So I'm not a fan of that model. It works for other people and they're happy with it. I think, faculty should get to decide in some ways. And then the last thing I'll say about that is when we need somebody to pitch hit, right? Like, so let's say one of your 4 criminal justice faculty has to be out on an emergency. We've got clinical folks who could, who are really steeped and could take that class on. And so it's a real collegial team environment. So somebody might step up and pitch in.
Yeah, I can imagine this is a situation where size is a real benefit to having, if you've got so many faculty members, and so just you can rearrange things, I imagine, more readily than if it's a smaller kind of school. But interesting. Well, this has been an incredibly interesting conversation. I want to thank you for having it. You've really added a piece of the puzzle to legal education, which has been missing. We had Pam Carlin on the show earlier, and she talked about her role in the clinical the Supreme Court clinic at law schools. But that was obviously one angle of it, and this is just a much broader perspective. So I want to thank you for coming on the show. It was incredibly interesting.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I'm glad I could join you.
Great.
All right. Take care.